Well, welcome to the sixth in this lecture series on risk. Those of you who were here last week will have heard how in the classical world, for apparently good reason, risk was seen to be so arbitrary and controllable that they treated it as essentially random. But earlier in the series we heard about how in our contemporary world we seek to measure risk and to minimize risk. But there's another feature of the times we live in, that there are people who, for political reasons, seek to maximize our perceptions of risk by means of terrorism. And the question is, how do we manage this alongside our individual freedoms? So our topic tonight is risk, security and terrorism. And it's a privilege to have Professor Lucia Zedner here to talk to us. She's the Professor of Criminal Justice at Oxford University, and she was educated at Oxford and worked for a time at London School of Economics and also at Mannheim before returning to Oxford. Her work started on women criminals in Victorian times, and she's published very widely on criminal justice. But more recently, she's been concerned with the very topical issue of preventative justice, which is a subject, of course, with profound implications for individual freedom. It's a pleasure to introduce Lucia Zedner.
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the Master and Fellows of Darwin for inviting me. As the Master indicated, my topic tonight is risk, security, and terrorism. And I want to begin, there's the title, to begin by considering what we mean about risk in this context. Social scientists are very keen to tell us that we live in a world risk society. But what does this mean post 9/11? Risk commentators were quick to add terrorism to the catalogue of risks, which they already had in view: health, environment, engineering, and natural catastrophes, which were said to characterize the world risk society. But the risks posed by terrorists are a very different order to those posed by natural catastrophes. If risk is to avoid becoming an undifferentiated and therefore meaningless amalgam of unnamed perils, we need to think a little bit harder about just what or who is at risk. And this is important because seeking security from risk has all the qualities of a trump card. Play the security hand and countervailing interests, not least our civil liberties, lose out. Despite their rarity, acts of terrorism pose a risk of catastrophic harm that inclines us to accept whatever means seem to offer some measure of protection. Although counter-terrorist measures may discriminate unfairly and erode our civil liberties, the urge to reduce risk prevails. Balancing liberty and security seems to assume that by degrading liberties, we can ensure security. What I want to suggest tonight is that we might do better to think about the whole range of risks associated with terrorism and to explore how seeking to avert harm itself may have the effect of introducing new risks. By focusing on the obvious threats to harm posed by terrorism to person, property, to our subjective sense of security, we risk overlooking a whole series of other risks, not least the risks that countering terrorism carries. Hazards like risks to political, social, and economic life, risks to social cohesion, community and race relations, risks of alienating those we target. And we arrive at the paradoxical situation that countering terrorism may actually make further attack more likely rather than less. So we need to think what risks are really at stake when we counter terrorism and how we might learn to live with risk. Risk has its roots in the natural sciences, where it involves probabilistic calculations of the likelihood of a hazard occurring. The scope for measuring physical and natural phenomenon is much greater than in respect of human behavior. Data about terrorist activity is less reliable still, and risk assessment more problematic. So it's questionable whether we can even safely talk about risk in a technical sense. We can observe four major differences between risk in science and risk in the terrorist field. And I'll just list them first for you: hard data, technical expertise, static risks, and scientific calculation. First of all, the natural sciences deal in hard data. It's generally more robust, calculable, and amenable to calculation than in the soft spheres of human activity. The validity of predictions about risk of stresses on a road bridge, for example, or the fallout from a nuclear plant, are simply of a different order than those that apply in the case of terrorism. When we look at the terrorist field, we're dealing with soft data. Human behavior isn't easily reducible to the numbers needed for scientific inquiry. And the comparative rarity of terrorist attacks further limits scope for calculations that rely upon data sets which are sufficiently large for statistical significance. Despite highly developed security operations, intelligence about security networks and their operations is sparse and erratic. As one US national security analyst has observed, there is no standard distribution curve for past security events that can be used to predict future terrorist attacks. The relative lack of data, the dangerousness of trying to obtain it, and the secrecy surrounding intelligence operations all combine to render hard facts in this sphere difficult to come by. Secondly, even where we seem to be dealing with quantifiable data, assessing terrorist risk is often based on the subjective professional judgment of psychiatrists, intelligence experts, and policy analysts. This data is then put to use in the field by security agents who filter it through a further layer of professional expertise and judgment. The technical language of risk calculation conceals an altogether less systematic process by which professional judgments and organizational interests stack one upon another to create a less stable edifice than the claims of science might suggest. Whereas we deal in the scientific field generally with static risks, when we look to the terrorism field, we see that those who engage in terrorism have a very high incentive to avoid being categorized as risky. Although terrorists do risky things, even suicide bombers want their operations to succeed. And indeed, for terrorist groups whose influence or reputation depends upon a reputation for effectiveness, detection is costly, well beyond the failed bomb plot. In general, scientific risks don't act in this reflexive way. They don't respond to categorization or try to conceal their riskiness or evade assessment. The earthquake is no more likely to occur, nor the volcano to erupt, because we monitor earth tremors or seismic activity. By contrast, risky behaviors by humans are dynamic. They change in a bid to outwit the measures we take against them. So that managing the threat that they pose requires reflexive strategies capable of responding to their adaptations and their evasions. Hardening one set of targets against attack, for example, introducing metal detectors at airports, or by using is liable to see terrorists switching targets. So instead of targeting airports, they'll target the London Underground, or elude profiling by using women or white men with Western-sounding names, like Mary Ann Murphy or Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. Such people fit no profile. They come up on no airline screening list. Alter the profiles, and the terrorists respond, so as to render precautions impotent almost as soon as they are made. Fourthly, unlike scientific calculation, the political considerations that apply in respect of the terrorist field are of a different order. Now, whilst no sphere of public policy is immune from politics, here we have a really highly charged political context in which risk-based strategies are implemented. The high premium on public protection, the level of public interest, and intense media coverage all combine to politicize terrorist risks to a degree unknown in other spheres. It distorts both our estimates of risk and our responses to them. And I'll have more to say about this in a moment. So what's new about the new terrorism? Just put my talk in the dark, thank you. I could ad lib. First, let's examine the primary risks posed by... Thank you. Let's examine the primary risks posed by terrorism itself. Now, of course, terrorism is not a new threat, but I want to suggest that what has changed is the global scale, the sheer scale and reach of the new terrorism. The number of those killed on 9/11, nearly 3,000, is not far short of the 3,500 people who were killed in the entire number of terrorist attacks in Northern Ireland since 1969. Not only is the scale of the threat much larger, but hidden networks developed by Al-Qaeda stretch across an estimated 65 countries. They make it very difficult to assess the risks posed by members and affiliates. Intelligence about the nature and the composition of these networks is likewise scarce and less easily reduced to suspect categories. And whereas most prior terrorist organizations had identifiable hierarchies and known leaders, relatively transparent command structures, and in the case of the IRA at least, gave official warnings before placing bombs against civilian targets, the rules of the terrorist game have now changed. The new terrorists resort to endlessly innovative and hence inherently unpredictable tactics. They're willing to use suicide bombers to sacrifice their operatives and to subscribe to a potent religious creed of jihad in which every infidel is a target, rather than setting constrained sets of specific demands. Now, although Al-Qaeda is often described as a network, it might better be thought of as a powerful ideology, an ideology that excites emulation, with the result that quite unaffiliated individuals plan and perpetrate attacks in its name. Both the Madrid and London bombings were carried out by individuals inspired by, but significantly not directed by Al-Qaeda. These so-called lone wolves are more difficult to detect. Neither are they known to intelligence agencies, nor do they fit any existing profiles. Together, these new features render the threats posed both palpably greater and, of course, far more difficult to predict. That said, it's helpful to put what we do know about the risks of terrorism in context. The facts are thought-provoking. For example, Muller tells us that an American's chance of being killed in one non-stop airline flight is about 1 in 13 million, even taking 9/11 into account. While to reach the same level of risk while driving on America's safest roads, one has to travel a mere 11.2 miles on rural interstate highways. Let's carry on a little playing with the numbers. If one leaves out the fatalities of 9/11, fewer people have died in America from international terrorism than have drowned in toilets. I decided to spare you the picture of people drowning in toilets. Actually, I couldn't find any. Even if one includes the numbers of those who died on 9/11, the number of Americans killed by terrorism since the late 1960s, when State Department records began, is about the same number as those killed over the same period by being struck by lightning, by accident causing deer, or severe allergic reaction to peanuts. I've spared you the peanuts as well. In almost every year since records began, the total number of people worldwide killed by international terrorism is not much more than the number who have died by drowning in the bath. We're still playing with numbers. Until 9/11, the largest single number of people killed in a single terrorist attack was 329 who were killed in an explosion on an Air India plane in 1985. And over the entire 20th century, fewer than 20 terrorist attacks have resulted in the deaths of more than 100 people. By contrast, notice that in the US, the number of people killed in road accidents runs at about 40,000 people per annum. Even in the UK, which has one of the lowest rates in Europe, deaths from road accidents stand at about 3,000 per annum. Now, to say that these deaths are tolerated might seem like the ultimate in callousness, But the relative public quiescence or acceptance of road traffic fatalities makes it difficult for me to conclude other than that raw magnitude alone is not decisive in determining the way that risks are deemed to be acceptable or unacceptable. Crucial, perhaps, is the malign intent that lies behind every terrorist attack. As the old proverb observes, even a dog knows the difference between being stumbled over and being kicked. Arguably, simply counting fatalities is misleading because it fails to take into account the larger financial, organisational, and political costs entailed by terrorist attacks. The billions of pounds and hours spent on surveillance, security, screening, and other operations needs to be taken into account in any attempt to specify or quantify the costs involved. Estimating the true cost of 9/11 is very controversial, and the estimates vary widely. But let me give you some figures. And I shan't read them out. You can read them for yourselves. They're very striking. If we add these costs to the shock, the devastation, and the sheer scale of the attack, I think it begins to explain why we're naturally more concerned by the loss of 3,000 lives on 9/11 than by the same or greater number of deaths on the road every year. I want to return now to the UK. When I began thinking about this lecture, I noticed that the current threat levels change from time to time. And just last month, the current UK threat level was raised to severe. The Home Secretary provided an explanation of this in a statement in which he said, we've raised the threat from international terrorism from substantial to severe. This means that a terrorist attack is highly likely. But I should stress that there is no intelligence to suggest that an attack is imminent. Now, maybe I'm not alone in struggling with what this statement might mean, and I've spent a lot of time trying to work out what it might mean. And that has led me, perhaps more productively, to think a little bit about what I might call rationality and risk. That is, to think about the way that risks impinge upon our consciousness. Because risks don't just exist out there. They're mediated through our perceptions and our understanding in ways that alter their force, irrespective of the numbers. So I'd like to suggest to the raw numbers, we need to add what one might call a catastrophe premium, on the grounds that numbers alone miss the important variable of human cognition. To the concrete threats to personal property posed by new terrorism, we need to add, therefore, the subjective risks to our collective sense of security. And there's a real dilemma here. How does one alert the public to the security risks that we face, to encourage us to be vigilant to the unattended bag, for example, and yet carry on our lives as normal? A certain level of risk awareness is actually useful to the security services. It encourages us to be prudent. It makes sure that we're willing to comply with security measures. But at what point does that awareness come to hinder our normal activities and cause us to limit our behavior in ways that are counterproductive and costly to society? Add to this the further danger that measures that are taken against terrorism and the political rhetoric used to justify them exacerbates our public fear, and we have a potentially toxic problem. How we limit the search for subjective security is a really big problem. If we acknowledge public fear as a tangible harm, how should the state respond? Should public concern license extensions of state power, particularly where those measures impinge upon particular groups or minorities? Subjective security is an important goal, but whether it should be allowed to count morally to permit liberty-eroding measures is doubtful, I'd suggest. The difficulty of minimizing risks to subjective security is illuminated by research on the psychology of risk perception. A central problem is the disproportionate salience of the most publicized risks, or what Tversky and Kahneman call the availability heuristic. If a risk occurs only rarely or is little known, we tend to underestimate the likelihood of it occurring because we lack the ability to imagine its impact. In the wake of a serious terrorist atrocity, we tend to draw upon this tangible experience the better to understand our world and to anticipate the future. Lacking direct access to the data that might enable us to calculate the likelihood of further attack, we have to rely on the readily available example. So, for example, in the year following 9/11, many Americans took to the roads because they feared to fly. An estimated additional 1,600 people died in road traffic accidents that year. Notice also that the risks against which we demand protection look remarkably like the events that have just occurred. Hence our focus on airport security and our relative lack of concern about ports or the Channel Tunnel. And even security experts, who one might expect to know better, rely on the availability heuristic. For example, when they focus upon in-flight security post 9/11, or screen airline passengers for liquids after a failed liquid bomb attack. Notice, too, that terrorists are themselves availability entrepreneurs. They're masters at manipulating public opinion, distorting our perceptions, and generating fear of threats dislocated from the reality or the likelihood of them actually occurring, and thus generating a fear of threat which is dislocated from probability. Threats of terrorist attack deliberately play on our past experiences and the difficulty that we have in distinguishing between probability and impact in order to maximize panic and disruption. Research in the psychology of risk perception further reveals additional factors that are crucial in evoking disproportionate perceptions. So, for example, we're overly impressed by the salience of the unfamiliar and the hard to control. Uncertainty is also a key factor. Apparently randomly distributed risks attract greater unease, even if the incidence is low, because of the difficulty we face in trying to assess whether we're at risk or not. Uncertainty makes it impossible for us to adapt our behavior or to avoid obviously risky situations or places. Our ability to estimate risks is limited here by what psychologists call probability neglect. That is, we have a tendency to ignore statistics, particularly where emotions are high. We're more likely to focus our fear on the bad outcome than upon evidence as to the likelihood of it occurring. The enormity of the potential catastrophe clouds out evidence as to probability. And media coverage only amplifies and dramatizes the terrorist risks to distort our perception further still. The result is that a fearful public irrationally demands governmental responses that are not actually warranted by the likelihood of the harm occurring. And although this raises questions about the desirability of a populist politics, to which I'll return, a public that is over-demanding of protection, regarding the public as incapable of rational calculation seems to justify an undue degree of deference to expert knowledge. So we have here a particular problem. Deference is hazardous because given the extraordinary powers and extensions of state power that are liable to result, how do we square the need for democratic accountability with evidence that a public, particularly a fearful public, are not well placed to make assessments of risk? Should we dismiss public fears as irrational? Or should we perhaps consider that even the most distorted apprehension of risk as an independent harm worthy of government response? Subjective risk, the terror inside terrorism, is not reducible to technical assessment. It's necessarily a matter of political decision-making and of public choice. So far, I've considered some of the objective and subjective risks posed by terrorism, but these are not the only risks in play. So let's consider some others. In what follows, we turn to a different set of risks, the risks inherent in countering terrorism. Analysing the full range of risks entailed by the attempt to counter terrorism reveals that countering terrorism is an inherently risky business. Let's consider some of the more important risks in play here. First of all, risk to expectations. Now, even to talk about the war on terror, capital W, capital T, raises public expectations about what can reasonably be achieved. The war analogy suggests that this is a campaign in which it's possible to achieve victory, that the enemy can be defeated, that peace will once again prevail. In reality, the risk of terrorism is probably ineradicable. We can introduce new legal powers, we can develop preemptive measures, we can expend vast public funds in a bid to prevent, but we can have no reasonable expectation of eliminating terrorism entirely. Criminologists have learned to talk about crime as a normal fact of everyday life. Given the scale of the harms at stake, we can never hope, and maybe we shouldn't even try to think about terrorism with such equanimity. But acknowledging the ineradicable nature of the terrorist risk might actually serve to limit our ambitions and constrain the promises that are made and the powers that are permitted in countering it. Such realism might not only place a limit on the coercive and liberty-eroding powers of the state, but also encourage us, the general public, to play our part in helping to minimize what we now recognize as an irremovable risk. Better informing the public also reduces the danger that when we alter our behavior to avoid feared risks, we generate new hazards born of those adaptations. The need to be realistic about what can plausibly be promised by way of protection is all the more important because quite another set of risks in play are what one might call risks to reputation. That is, the risks faced by ministers, governments, and public servants if attacks do occur that call into question their professional judgment or expertise. The political risks of getting it wrong are potentially ruinous to political reputation and electoral support. Likewise, security and police chiefs stand to suffer devastating damage to their professional standing if they fail to foresee or to preempt an attack. So they tend constitutionally to be risk-averse. Generally, underestimating a threat poses a greater risk to reputation than overestimating it. Little blame attaches to the security chief who takes too cautious an approach, even if no threat actually arises. But the security chief who ignores a warning or fails to take preventive measures will likely suffer huge reputational loss if that risk does eventuate. I say generally here because, of course, overestimating and misattributing risks can themselves result in actions that are ruinous to reputation and can be tragic in their consequences. The shooting of an innocent man, Jean-Charles de Menezes, in the London Underground by the Metropolitan Police just weeks after the July 2005 London bombings, and only a day after a further failed bomb attack, is an obvious example. In this case, it resulted in a tragic loss of life that had major ramifications too for the reputation of the Metropolitan Police and its commissioner, who resigned as a consequence. So we need to add to our basket of risks those of political, professional, and reputational risk as potential costs in countering terrorism, whose avoidance can have the effect of distorting priorities and damaging decision-making. A further, less obvious class are what we might call organizational risks. That is, the risks to an institution's ability to function effectively. And an important consideration in countering terrorism is the need to eliminate or minimize risks to the efficacy of security organizations themselves. Potential risks to the security of intelligence operations, their agents, and their informants stand behind the need or desire to place a bar on the disclosure of intelligence. Organizational risk is said to justify security classifications that deny public access to intelligence, to excuse the use of redacted evidence, even in court, and has led to the introduction of special advocates or special security-cleared lawyers who are permitted to see evidence against their clients, but not to divulge it to them. Protecting their interests, the interests and operations of security operations, is here privileged over the historic right of the defendant to see the evidence against them. Notice also that these very same organisations have a vested interest in magnifying risks in order to secure greater resources and greater power. The larger the purported risk, the higher the funding, the stronger the legal powers, the bigger the role those organisations can claim. And this partly explains the extraordinary and fast-growing costs of risk reduction in this field. Countering terrorism is an expensive business. Funding it raises the opportunity costs entailed. In 2007, the Comprehensive Spending Review announced security spending by 2011 would rise to $3.5 billion. Of this, an additional $240 million was funded particularly for terrorism or counter-terrorism. This huge investment of public funds in security clearly poses a hazard to other areas of government, and it points to the importance of a cost-benefit analysis in this sphere. The billions that are spent on security are not available for the pursuit of other public goods. So importantly, deploying these opportunity costs becomes a potent check on government, a check that can be expected to appeal across a wider political spectrum, I would suggest, than the traditional left-leaning liberal defence of civil liberties. Let's now turn to a rather different and even more alarming set of risks, what I call countervailing risks, namely the danger that counter-terrorism policies themselves spawn new security threats. I want to begin by looking at what the experts call risk-risk trade-offs, namely the requirement that officials weigh the risks against each other in a bid to determine which strategy or measure is most likely to be reductive of all the risks in play. Risk-risk trade-offs are most acute in emergency situations or crises. So tackling terrorist hostage-taking, for example, often results in fine calculations as to the risks to the hostages themselves, and sometimes tragically results in the deaths of those hostages, as well as terrorists. And we've seen that arming the police can result in civilian deaths. Beyond the hard choices thrown up by emergency situations, the ongoing day-to-day security operations may also produce countervailing risks that are perhaps less obvious but no less grave. Security policies that target minorities or particular groups, for example, most obviously young male men of Middle Eastern appearance, are likely to have a detrimental effect on their well-being, their social life, levels of integration and ability to move around the world unhindered. The effect of being targeted by security measures fosters a sense of isolation and alienation. And over time, the impact may be to exacerbate the risk of resentment and hostility, which may predispose those so targeted to religious radicalization, political extremism, and even aid to their recruitment by terrorist groups. It's by no means only domestic counterterrorism policies that have this effect. The invasion and occupation of Iraq is probably the most well-documented instance of a policy justified on the grounds of countering terrorism that served significantly to increase new recruits. Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, the practice of extraordinary rendition were similarly inflammatory in their effect. Whilst the publicity surrounding torture, degrading treatment, and humiliation of terrorist suspects may have recruited many to terrorist cells. A fuller picture of these countervailing risks would require a more systematic analysis of the effects of counterterrorism on the alienation and disaffection of Muslim youth. Important, too, are the risks to wider community relations. Very often, these are the very communities which the police and security services rely upon for intelligence about possible terrorist attacks. Practices such as profiling and dawn raids upon minority communities may entrench suspicion amongst the general public. And even ostensibly neutral counter-terrorist laws, if applied in ways that in practice discriminate against particular religious or ethnic minority communities, have the effect of damaging intra-community relations, stirring up racial hatred or religious discrimination. These risks to targeted communities or suspect populations are prime examples of how measures that are intended to counter terrorism can too easily generate new risks. These new risks need to be traded off against the security gains. Precautionary measures that serve only to recruit new terrorists or to displace terrorist activity to softer targets or achieve security in one sphere only at the expense of another may turn out to increase rather than to decrease risks to security overall. Let us also think about what I call the collateral risks of countering terrorism. In addition to the risks to security itself, we need to be alert to the risks to the very institutions, the very values we seek to protect against terrorist threat, not least liberal democracy and the rule of law. Much of the debate post 9/11 has focused on the priority of seeking security or pursuing security and the inevitability in so doing of foregoing civil liberties. In times of crisis or emergency, it's argued, we shouldn't be too precious about protecting civil liberties that stand in the way of measures that are capable of averting a terrorist attack. Measures like surveillance and data retention, profiling, identity cards, DNA-based databases, and extended powers of arrest and detention are just some of the most obvious liberty-eroding measures. And this leads to a clear erosion of rights. The erosion of rights to freedom of speech, to privacy, to the presumption of innocence, rights to access to counsel and free communication with counsel, rights to a fair trial, and even rights of freedom of movement and freedom of the person. All are casualties of this approach. Responses to the risk of terrorist attack thus generate new risks to human rights. So instead of setting up a problematic binary between security and liberty, in which liberty is always liable to be the loser is a luxury that we simply can't afford when the stakes are high, might we not do better to recognize the risk to rights posed by counter-terrorism measures? A second group that we might want to think about, or a second larger field, is the risks to the rule of law. Now, of course, there are very good reasons for permitting states to authorize the use of coercion to protect the public from catastrophe. Preventive measures permit the police to intervene before an offense has been committed, the courts to incapacitate those who pose a danger. Preventive measures allow for intervention at an early stage before the harm has occurred, and may even have a deterrent effect upon prospective perpetrators. Even suicide bombers, who may be willing to risk death, are not willing to risk the failure of their own enterprise. Yet powers to intervene early and in respect of actions remote from the commission of an attack carry the risk of rendering illegal conduct which would otherwise be lawful, and of permitting premature, oppressive measures that erode individual liberties and pose a serious risk to the rule of law. In addition, recent years have seen a remarkable proliferation of counter-terrorism legislation that alters the very nature of criminal liability. The ambit of the criminal law has been extended under successive counter-terrorist laws that criminalize a very wide range of offences for glorifying, encouraging, assisting, planning, preparing terrorist attacks, and for publishing and disseminating pro-terrorist literature. Given that the very definition of terrorism is wide enough to capture many forms of political protest and of civil disobedience, the risks of over-criminalisation should not be ignored. So too have counter-terrorism measures given rise to new legal forms. I'll just talk about one, because I think it's the most important. The control order is a measure introduced in 2005, brought in under civil proceedings. It has the power to impose quasi-house arrest and considerable restrictions of movement, communication, and association upon terrorist suspects whom the Home Secretary considers, and I quote from the legislation, in the cases where it is necessary for purposes connected with protecting members of the public from a risk of terrorism. What that risk is, what the meaning of the word necessary is not articulated in the Act. Significantly, despite being a civil order, the control order is backed by lengthy imprisonment for any breach. So, for example, somebody under a control order who permits a probation officer or a police officer into their house without demanding identification would find themselves in breach. Somebody under control order who, standing in their back garden, greets their neighbour over the fence would be in breach. Allowing the civil law to be used for criminal law purposes in this instance leaves those who are subject to control orders subject to penal orders, but without any of the protections normally provided in a criminal trial or in respect of criminal sanctions. And perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that control orders have been the subject of a very long run of appeal cases, which have questioned their compatibility with important human rights. I've already mentioned the use of special advocates, those specially security-cleared lawyers who are given access to sensitive information, but once they've seen that information, can have no further communication with their clients. The use of secret evidence is likewise a major casualty of counterterrorism policy, where that evidence can't be seen by defendants and cannot be used as the basis of a defense against charges made. So responses to risk need to be reconciled with some very basic legal principles. Principles such as certainty, transparency, proportionality, and equality. Recognizing risks to rights and risks to the rule of law writ large is just one way of making absolutely clear that more than one set of risks are in play. And just as the risks of terrorism are not reducible to statistics, so the adverse consequences of counterterrorism measures may not be amenable to quantification. No price can easily be put upon the collateral and countervailing costs that I've just outlined. And that brings us to yet another thorny question, namely who should weigh and assess those risks? Because it should by now be clear that the risks raised by terrorism are very many and very varied. And the issues arise not least in order to resolve what level of intervention and what measures are necessary, what measures are proportional. This in turn raises important questions about the role of expert knowledge, about political accountability and adherence to the rule of law. Should assessing the risk of terrorism be considered a matter of technocratic determination, best left to intelligence agencies and risk experts? Or is it properly a matter of political deliberation and democratic engagement and parliamentary scrutiny? Given that, as we have seen, the public are liable to be over-cautious in their estimation of levels of risk and overestimating their need for protection, some have argued that the assessment of risk in this sphere is better left to the experts. This assumes, of course, that we can have confidence in those experts, that their deliberations are unbiased, and that deference to their expertise doesn't diminish their accountability. Fear, I would suggest, need not point to a populist approach in which public opinion is allowed to dictate policy, but the public need a place. And perhaps a more sophisticated approach would be to allow expert opinion, political accountability, public scrutiny, and debate to be brought to bear upon the twin activities of assessing and managing risk. The issues at stake are not merely evidential or technical, but they're also inherently political. How large must a risk be before we tackle it? How large must it be before we take costly steps to avert it? What is the statistical probability of an attack, and where that probability is low? What level of public spending? What erosion of civil liberties is merited? How we measure the risks to other public goods, like community, privacy, freedom of speech, and public projects such as healthcare, education, and social welfare, implied by these security programs, is also a matter for debate. And the role of the courts here is crucial. Is fear a cost that should weigh in the balance? Do risks to subjective security suffice as a ground for security measures that are costly or detrimental to individual interests? If the public are irrationally fearful, should the government respond, and if so, how? In weighing up all these considerations, it can be argued that the judiciary has a vital role to play as a crucial institutional safeguard against policies that are motivated primarily by fear. Public fear and political considerations are legitimate concerns, but they risk allowing terrorism to become a license for a new terror, what I would call the terror of prevention. Yet, if an overly populist response to terrorism has its perils, so too does undue deference. Deference to expert knowledge or to technocratic expertise is problematic because the risks posed by terrorism may be ones that those experts are less well equipped to deal with. How one assesses and weighs the range of collateral and countervailing risks that I've just discussed is a matter for a wider range of expertise and interests. Moreover, since expert intelligence remains undisclosed to the public, deference severely limits the possibilities for open political deliberation. Now, it's probably inevitable, particularly in times of crisis or heightened security, that the executive will cede to itself extraordinary lawmaking powers. But this is not to say that the exercise of those powers should remain beyond scrutiny. And it's in this respect that I think the role of the courts is crucial. Whereas Parliament may be directly pressured by public fear, the courts, at one step remove, are arguably better placed to question the need for new powers, to ensure that derogations are actually temporary, proportional, and necessary. And what about the role of the judges? By virtue of their structural independence, judges are particularly well placed to exercise scrutiny. They can make decisions concerning the most vulnerable and the most excluded in our society. In so doing, they serve security in the less usual, or one might say the classical sense, of securing the interests of individuals against the power of the state. As David Feldman has argued, and I'll quote, "The judiciary alone voluntarily shoulders the discipline of rationality, of rationally and publicly justifying its decisions. The judiciary alone subjects itself to the further discipline of framing its justification by reference to legal norms and objective standards." Close and critical judicial scrutiny might well be backed up by a culture of what I'd like to call presumptive mistrust, in which judges regard all new counter-terrorist measures as inherently suspect and in need of justification. The greater the risk to civil liberties posed, the heavier should be the burden of judicial scrutiny and the need to justify. Judicial scrutiny also has the advantage of taking place ex post facto. And this is particularly useful in identifying prior errors and overstated claims, and so improving the framework for future decision-making. Now, it should by now be clear that it's neither possible to eliminate the risks of terrorism, nor is it costless to try to do so. But acknowledging the ineradicable quality of terrorism need not entail passive resignation. Resilience has become a motivating concept in an attempt to find ways of living with and minimizing risks. Resilience strategies seek to ensure rapid recovery after catastrophic events. Resilience is the capacity to absorb shocks and bounce back. Now, resilience has a bit of a dodgy history. The Protect and Survive campaign of the 1970s, which aimed to increase public preparedness for a nuclear attack, was much ridiculed, not least actually by Raymond Briggs in his devastating cartoon strip, When the Wind Blows. And the American campaigns were not much better. In the event of a nuclear attack, they invited the public to duck and cover. Today's resilience programs are altogether more sophisticated. They involve complex strategies, networks and measures that seek to tackle the entire portfolio of risks in play. Resilience strategies typically emphasize a whole series of different elements, which I'd like to identify. First of all, identifying vulnerability. One of the key strategies under the government's resilience campaign is to use community-based multi-agency initiatives to identify those within the community who are vulnerable to becoming involved in violent extremism or radicalization. These projects, working at ground level, identify individuals, take referrals, and subject those individuals to a program of intervention designed to avert the risk of their recruitment. By engaging with, educating, empowering, and encouraging communities to become involved in these programs, an important means is instituted of ensuring resilience from the bottom up. Building resistance amongst communities is also important, and not just a matter for central government alone. The National Security Strategy seeks to increase the resistance of communities by strengthening civil society, by enhancing economic opportunities, and by providing education and training. Again, with the idea of reducing alienation and radicalization. Other strategies involve ensuring critical infrastructure, be they energy supplies, communication, transport, or other systems which are vulnerable to terrorist attack. So, for example, the British government's contest strategy, which is the current resilience strategy, insists, and I quote, that protective security measures for transport systems must reduce the risk of attack, increase resilience, and ensure minimal disruptive impact, and retain the confidence of people who are travelling. Resilience is sought not only through preventive strategies, but also by ensuring rapid recovery. Resilience kicks in when an attack does occur, ensuring the necessary resources, infrastructure, and networks to tackle the effects of a terrorist attack and to minimize the harm done, the damage and disruption caused, for example, to medical and emergency services, to communication and transport networks, is absolutely crucial. The aim here is to curtail the impact, to reduce the consequent hazards, to mitigate the disruption, to ensure continuity, and so to enable a swift recovery. The lessons learned from 9/11 and the July London bombings are very important. I'll just note, actually, that the Emergency Communication Nerve Center for terrorist attacks in New York was located within one of the Twin Towers, within the World Trade Center itself, with devastating consequences. Even if in the immediate aftermath of an attack, the emphasis is on recovery, in the longer term, distributing clear and accurate information to the public becomes essential to alleviating public anxiety, to help the public to protect themselves from further dangers, and to assist those who respond and support subsequent investigations. Resilience, then, involves the distinctly Darwinian notion of survival. In the longer term, the emphasis is rather upon ensuring that critical national infrastructure remains intact, that it continues to deliver essential services, and that the disruption to social, political, and economic life is minimized. Resilience is thus not only a governmental strategy, but also very much a matter for the community. Resilience is important, ensuring that both communities and organizations have that capacity to bounce back. And the process has been described in this resilience cycle, a cycle beginning on the left with preparedness, response to an attack, assisting with recovery, and in the bid to make the image larger, we've lost mitigation of loss from the bottom. But mitigation of loss is important too. So allow me to conclude. In other spheres of economic, social, and political life, academics have encouraged us to embrace risk, to appreciate what's called the uncertain promise of risk. The idea of embracing risk in this sphere is hardly a plausible injunction, where the risk of taking, the taking of risk promises little gain, and the failure to avert risk results in catastrophic harm. Not least because, as we've shown, to the objective and subjective risks of terrorism, we need also to recognize that trying to eliminate the risk of terrorism spawns its own risks. These opportunity costs of countering terrorism include costs to political freedom, social cohesion, to tolerance, diversity, to human rights, and other important attributes of a liberal democracy. Waging an all-out war on terror would simply be intolerable in its costliness. Appreciating the full portfolio of potential risks that I've spoken about, the organizational and reputational risks, the collateral risks, and the countervailing risks, and a systematic analysis of all of these risks can play a powerful counterweight to the demands for security, as a counterweight for measures that are targeted only against the most obvious risks that terrorism poses. In addition, we need critical oversight and scrutiny. We need a comprehensive review of all the risks in play, the opportunity costs, the collateral harms, and countervailing risks. And this is surely a better way of ensuring us that we're enabled to understand what really is at stake when we seek to counter the risk of terrorism. And finally, resilience strategies provide alternate means of ensuring that we reduce the risk, lessen the impact, and enhance our ability to recover. Such strategies might just enable us to learn to live with risk without living in terror. Thank you.
Well, I think it was the sociologist Max Weber who said that the essence of power in a relationship is the ability to manipulate the uncertainty confronting the other people in that relationship. And terrorism clearly does that in spades. Professor Zedner's given us a fascinating account of the psychological cat and mouse game of risk creation and risk prevention. And she's drawn our attention to the amplification of perceived risks played by for quite sensible, or anyway, understandable reasons by both the media and the security agencies, thereby doing the recruitment and propaganda far better than the terrorists could do ever on their own. And it's drawn our attention to the very corrosive effect on freedoms, creating these strange neologisms of redaction and rendition, what she describes as the terror of prevention. I think what we'll take back from Professor Zedner's talk is that she's not despairing, and she has a strategy of developing resilience through education, through judicial scrutiny. And I thought it was great that someone who in many ways as a lawyer, gave us so little law, but such a broad insight into the use of the law, and strengthening a civil society rather than dividing it, and by mitigating disruption. An extraordinarily interesting and thorough account of one of the extraordinary features of the modern age. Thank you very much indeed.